located in 62 historic districts and 9 district extensions, places like the Laramie State Bank in Austin, and even the Promontory Park points in Hyde Park, and the Phoebe and John Gray House in Old Irving Park. Every time there's a building permit application for any one of these properties, staff determine whether the work impacts a protected feature that's identified in the landmark designation. If so, they ensure the project aligns with U.S. Department of the Interior's guidelines, which is a huge responsibility and part of the essence of what designations are all about. It's a never-ending workload, but I'm pleased to report that more than 90% of building permits for landmark properties are processed within a couple weeks. That's nearly light speed compared to some municipal processes. For more complicated projects, staff draw on their technical wisdom and help property owners meet preservation guidelines in a cost-effective and timely manner, regardless of if it's a high-profile property like the John M. Murphy Memorial downtown or a single row home in historic Pullman. They provide the same invaluable expertise on behalf of the building, the owner, and the city itself. But that's not all. Staff also administer the demolition delay ordinance and the Chicago Historic Resources Survey. They manage the city's annual Preservation Excellence Awards, and they coordinate approvals for all the preservation incentives that are available to landmark property, including property tax abatement, adopt a landmark grants, permit fee waivers, and other benefits that make many restoration projects possible. Collectively, these and other responsibilities represent the core of the city's formal preservation efforts. They've made the Commission on Chicago Landmarks one of the most highly regarded agencies in the state of Illinois, and they ensure that Chicago's legacy as a center of modern architecture will resonate for generations to come. So please join me in thanking DPD's Historic Preservation Division staff for all their tireless, often unthanked efforts on behalf of the city of Chicago. Now, of course, many people play important roles as well, from the people who fill out our landmark designation forms, to the docents who lead tours and make the city's history come alive, to the elected officials and city council who approve our designations. Which brings me to our next speaker. I'm delighted that one of our elected leaders has joined us today to share some remarks. He's the alderman of the beautiful 2nd Ward right here in Streeterville. So please help me welcome Alderman Brian Hopkins.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Boatwright, and congratulations to you and your staff and an outstanding beginning to your term as Commissioner. You hit the ground running. It's been a relatively short period of time, but you just heard the list of accomplishments that you have already achieved is only just begun. So we're very delighted to have you in that role, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Raise your hand if you're excited to hear Geoffrey Baer. Let's see those hands. Now raise your hand if you're here to see Geoffrey Baer, but you're excited because you think there's a free tote bag involved in it. Usually there is, and I think we do. We have free tote bags. Do we have umbrellas? No umbrellas, just tote bags. But don't worry, you're not going to be disappointed at not getting an umbrella, because Geoffrey Baer is always an engaging, informative, delightful speaker, and we're just thrilled to have you here today, Geoffrey, and I look forward to hearing your remarks as well. Now, I'm privileged to represent this community, this neighborhood, and this ward, Streeterville in particular. We have a lot of historic points of interest in this ward that I represent. Geoffrey talks about some of them and has for years in his role as a docent and on the architecture boat tours and some of the specials that he's done over the years. So many of them are in my ward. I feel a special responsibility to be a custodian For example, the water tower and the Waterworks building. We're talking about some significant renovations to the Waterworks building right now, home of Looking Glass Theater. They want to do some expansion work, and of course their priority is not only expanding and engaging that building once again so it's in active use, but preserving its existing facade in the way that it's appeared for all these decades in Chicago as a historical landmark. And there's other examples of that here in Streeterville, including, by the way, Streeterville gets its name. Streeterville itself is named after a historic figure, George Wellington Streeter, who I think was also a part of some of the narration on some of your tours, Geoffrey. And I just want to use that example to reflect today on the transformative property of history and the redemptive property of history. We have a statue to George Wellington Streeter here in Streeterville, a statue to him as if he is a hero or an icon. And I happen to have been acquainted with the artist who did that sculpture, who unfortunately left us just a few months ago. Dennis Downs, noted sculptor and artist, died recently. But he told me when he was commissioned to do that work, he was the first artist who could build a statue to George Streeterville and expect acclaim rather than condemnation. Why? Well, 100 years had passed since George Wellington Streeter did those things that he was famous for. He was a scoundrel. He was a scallywag. He was a thug. He was a pimp. He was a con artist, a fraudster. He was a murderer. Think about that. And yet, 100 years later, we can build a statue to him. It took the passage of time. It took the redemptive property of time to make that acceptable. Because in addition to all those awful things that George Wellington Streeter was, today he's a great story. He's a great story that deserves to be told, a story that we as Chicagoans and Streeterville residents in particular love to tell. And we love the fact that we have an iconic location that we can use as a launching pad to tell those stories. That is one of the best things about historic preservation. It gives us a launching pad for our stories as Americans. And not every one of those stories, folks, has a happy ending. Some of those stories, people got harmed. George Wellington Streeter actually did murder someone. So think about that the next time someone tells you that we have to take away a statue, we have to tear down a building, we have to remove a piece of history because something about that story wasn't necessarily all roses and rainbows. We are obligated to not only preserve our history, but to tell all our stories, to tell them honestly, to tell them truthfully, to reflect upon them, and to learn from them. So I'm excited to be the alderman of this ward and have those continued stories to tell, and I look forward to Commissioner Boatwright is going to introduce a storyteller who is much more accomplished than I, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy his remarks. So thank you, everyone. Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Alderman Hopkins. Our next speaker is an 8-time Emmy-winning writer, producer, and program host that has been a fixture on WTTW for 30 years. He's recognized for dozens of documentaries and TV appearances about Chicago's history and architecture. And he's also known nationally for the PBS primetime series 10 That Changed America, about buildings, monuments, streets, and bridges that are synonymous with the evolution of the United States. He's our keynote speaker. Please welcome Geoffrey Baer. Just one sec. So Geoffrey is actually going to stay on stage for about 5 minutes following his Q&A, and we're going to have mics circulating the room. So if you have questions, you'll want to just raise your hand because he's going to stick around for some questions. So again, a huge welcome and thanks to Geoffrey Baer.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Oh my goodness, thank you. Wonderful. Hi everybody. Good. Actually, I'm on the board of Looking Glass Theater, and I was involved in moving into the Water Tower Waterworks. And this is actually a little bit of a preservation story. I wasn't planning to start with this, but when Looking Glass Theater, which is a bunch of kids from Northwestern University that've gone on to great importance and great importance and fame. It was always an itinerant theater. We were in like found spaces. We'd do one play in a warehouse and we'd do another one in a storefront. And when we were offered the Waterworks building, it's a working pumping station. You still get your water from the Waterworks. And it was really important to me that I wanted, with this history of having been an industrial building, I wanted people to see the water pumps as they were coming into the theater, to just sort of recall that found space. And in order to do that, we had to put the entrance where it is now, which is just off Michigan Avenue. But that was a window, it wasn't a door. And our architect, John Morris, went to the Chicago History Museum. Because it was a landmark, we saw that there was a stoop. We had to prove that it had once been a door, or you cannot just punch a hole in a wall in a historic, a landmark building. And sure enough, we found pictures and it was a door. So we were able to return it to its original condition, and now we're reconfiguring it now, so it won't be the same. But people walk past the water pumps as they're on their way into the theater. So I was really kind of thrilled that we were able to do that. Okay, that's enough of that old story. Let's see if this will move ahead. Here we go. So in the early 1960s, Chicago's magnificent federal building, dating from 1905 by architect Henry Ives Cobb, was threatened with demolition. And it was going to be replaced by a new complex of 3 buildings designed by world-famous Chicago architect Mies van der Rohe, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. And of course, Mies was the most important pioneer of modernist glass and steel architecture, so everybody knew that the new federal building was not in any way going to resemble the old one with its glistening gilt dome and classical columns and arches and pediments. So shortly before the demolition was scheduled to begin, a 12-year-old boy named Tim Samuelson somehow managed to get a one-on-one meeting with Mies van der Rohe in his office. Tim, this 12-year-old boy, begged Mies not to tear down the glorious old dowager. Years later, Tim recalled the meeting in a Chicago Tribune article. He said, quote, "I ran my mouth, after which there was a long silence. And then Mies said, 'Someday, I hope you will look on the new building and see many of the things you admire in the old building.'" And I'll let you compare the two. I'm going to show you some clips here. I'm going to let you compare the two in this clip from a show I made about the Chicago Loop. Now, I made this show in 2011, so fair warning, don't be shocked by how much I have aged in 13 years. And the clip I'm going to show, this is one of 3 clips I'm going to show. This one starts with a little bit about Mies van der Rohe himself. I think we need the audio on that. So let me go back. Got the audio now? Let's see.
Mies's personality seemed to match his austere vision. His Chicago apartment had almost no furniture in it. Among his few indulgences were fine cigars and a collection of paintings by Paul Klee. Mies's federal building is one of 4 big government buildings on our tour. Historically, many government buildings in this country have been modeled on Greek and Roman architecture, like the old federal building that once stood on this site, designed by Henry Ives Cobb. The 16-story dome was larger in diameter than the U.S. Capitol dome. The interior was polished granite, white marble, and gilded bronze, according to the book Lost Chicago by David Garrard Lowe. It was demolished in 1965. With his new federal center, Mies replaced splendor with simplicity. He created 3 enormous dark slabs, a flat one, a wide one, and a tall one. and carefully arranged them on a broad, open plaza. Mies said, "God is in the details," and he spent countless hours working out the exact proportions for his buildings. He even specified the placement of these seams in the plaza's pavement. Look how they line up exactly with the window mullions and columns in each of the three buildings. In a sense, this is Mies's graph paper.
All right, so, yeah, I looked a lot younger, didn't I? That 12-year-old boy, Tim Samuelson, who bravely confronted Mies, grew up to be the city of Chicago's cultural historian, a job they invented for him. He is a walking encyclopedia of Chicago architecture and history, a hoarder of architectural relics, which I hope someday will end up in a museum. And FYI, Tim, now retired, lives in a Mies van der Rohe designed apartment building. Mies was not persuaded by Tim's prepubescent pleas, but we should not assume that Mies was oblivious to the historical significance of architecture or opposed to preservation. According to some accounts, he carefully considered the placement of that plaza at the Federal Center in an effort to protect one of the neighboring historic buildings. The plaza is framed on three sides by buildings that Mies designed for the Federal Center, but depending on where he put the plaza, the tall tower, which is the Kluzinski building, depending on where he put that building, the fourth building overlooking the plaza, so in other words, the fourth wall of the plaza, as it were, would either be the Monadnock building from 1891 by architects Burnham and Root, which is across Jackson Street, and by the way, you can still see the old Federal building is still there in this picture, or the Marquette building from 1895 by architects Halliburton and Roche, which is across Adams Street. And this is the building before it was restored. You can see the cornice is gone there. And it's said that Mies believed whichever building ended up fronting on the plaza, like the fourth wall of the plaza, was going to be more susceptible to demolition in the future because it would have these nice views of the plaza. So after much consideration, Mies placed the Kluzinski building so that the Marquette building would front on the plaza, reasoning that the Monadnock building, the tallest load-bearing skyscraper ever built, was more historically important and therefore less likely to be torn down if it was overshadowed by the tall tower. Now, this story could be apocryphal. We don't really know if it's true. But regardless, thankfully, neither the Monadnock nor the Marquette has been torn down, and both are now Chicago landmarks and have been beautifully restored. All right, so what does this say about balancing development and progress with preservation, which Commissioner Boatwright, I think, thinks about all the time? I got an interesting take on that when I was fortunate to interview this legendary Yale University art and architecture historian, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, Vincent Scully. In 2010, I interviewed him. He's now gone. I interviewed him at his home in Florida. Architects and preservationists revered Scully for his deep insights into the history of architecture. And he told me that he admired Mies, and specifically, he likes the Federal Center, or he liked the Federal Center. Yes, he acknowledged that glass and steel was certainly a departure from what stood there before, but cities need to evolve and they need open public spaces. But what he said he really liked about these buildings was the way that the windows reflect the buildings around them, which are historic. They reflect their context. So what he decried was the wholesale bulldozing of historic context and replacing it with block after block after block of glass towers on empty plazas. And that's exactly what happened in mid-20th century in New York on parts of Park Avenue and elsewhere after Mies designed this building, the iconic Seagram building. After that opened, it was partly a fad on Park Avenue and elsewhere, but it was also because developers were given the right to build extra floors if their buildings didn't occupy the full site. So hence you get these lifeless plazas fronting on the street. And the result, he said, is a house of, Scully said this, the result is a house of mirrors where all the glass buildings reflect all the other glass buildings, and you get this dead zone after hours when workers go home at the end of the day. So many of my TV shows over the years have had stories of preservation battles lost and preservation battles won. And some of those historic battles were epic. You got the wholesale bulldozing of neighborhoods to build expressways in the mid-20th century, and how routing at least some of those expressways seems to have been calculated to enforce racial segregation. You have the fierce struggle led mainly by women to save Little Italy and Greektown and other immigrant enclaves on the near west side to no avail. After the residents were relocated and the land was cleared, we got the only university probably that was ever named for a highway interchange, originally called the University of Illinois Chicago Circle Campus. Of course, now it's UIC. It was a concrete fortress that for the most part didn't integrate with the existing street grid, where students could use the new highway system to conveniently commute to and from school without ever engaging with the surrounding city. And it should be said that this is a condition that UIC has spent decades undoing to better connect with their community. There was the demolition of the oldest building in the Loop, the Little McCarthy building, built just a year after the Great Fire by Chicago's first professional architect, John Mills Van Osdol. The city tore it down along with all the other buildings on what still is called Block 37, to clean the slate for development. Instead, Block 37 remained an empty lot for more than 20 years before something was finally built on that site. And then Northwestern University tore down Prentice Women's Hospital, which is literally kitty corner from here. I passed it on the way. They replaced it with this glass laboratory building, even though there is a vacant lot directly across the street from it. This was over the heartfelt protests and objections of people like me, who fondly remember looking out of those kooky oval windows, holding our babies, which had just been born right there at Prentice Hospital, where my daughter was born. And then there was a particular period in the 1960s and 70s when many buildings were seen as just old and outdated, but not old enough yet to be considered historic. And social forces like white flight and suburban sprawl took their toll on city neighborhoods and the vibrancy of the Loop after working hours. In particular, buildings by Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler, who had pioneered skyscrapers' design and also pioneered a sort of truly original new architectural aesthetic. These buildings by Adler and Sullivan were just falling to the wrecking ball left and right. And this led to that. So this is the arch of the famous Stock Exchange building. This is the Stock Exchange building itself. This led to a preservation battle with a tragic story at its center that may have turned the tide in Chicago. So I'm going to show you another clip from that Chicago Loop program that I made in 2011 when I looked much younger. And leading into the clip in this show, I told about Louis Sullivan's death, the architect Louis Sullivan's death, virtually penniless and all but forgotten except by the architects who admired him. So here's the next clip I'll show you.
After Sullivan's sad end, his buildings didn't fare much better. It was the age of urban renewal, and scores of them were torn down.
Let's start that again, because that was a little quiet. Are we ready?
After Sullivan's sad end, his buildings didn't fare much better. It was the age of urban renewal, and scores of them were torn down. 40 years after Sullivan's death, one man became obsessed with saving Sullivan's buildings, and it cost him his life. Photographer Richard Nickel began a project to document all of Sullivan and Adler's buildings before they were demolished. Soon, he started collecting actual fragments as the buildings were torn down, often sneaking into dangerous demolition sites to pry treasures off the wall. Before long, his garage and backyard were filled with pieces of lost buildings. Eventually, he began organizing political campaigns to save the buildings, but most were torn down anyway. For 2 years, preservationists fought to save Sullivan's great stock exchange. When it was apparent they couldn't win, Nickel and others spent months dismantling the lavish trading room so it could be reassembled at the Art Institute. This is the trading room today. As you can see, the entire room has been completely reconstructed in meticulous detail here inside the Art Institute. But Nickel's story doesn't have a happy ending. Nickel just couldn't stay away from the stock exchange. He was 43. He had plans to give up the fight and get married. But he kept sneaking back into the unstable building. Finally, on Friday the 14th of April, 1972, Nickel failed to show up for a family dinner. His friends went looking for him at the stock exchange. They found his hard hat beneath a gaping hole in the partially demolished trading room floor. It took searchers 26 days to find his body, which was buried in the rubble below. Nearly 40 years after his death, Nickel's long-dreamed-of book about Louis Sullivan was finally published. Nickel's death may have helped turn the tide in an age when Chicago seemed to have forgotten its architectural heritage.
Yeah, and actually, Ward Miller here was involved in that book, and so was Tim Samuelson, who I introduced at the beginning here, and he was one of the people actually who went looking for Richard Nickel on that awful day. So there were some preservation victories even before the movement that Richard Nickel was a part of, and many more after his death. So we'll turn the tide here and talk about victories. This is Glessner House on South Prairie Avenue. So this is where I trained to be a docent or a tour guide for the Chicago Architecture Foundation, is what it was called back then. Now it's called the Chicago Architecture Center. We've got our docent training here in Glessner House. Today, this is in the really booming, vibrant South Loop. But when I was training there in 1987, this area was just, seemed like it had been all but totally forgotten. So this had been the city's Gold Coast in the late 1800s, home to Chicago's wealthiest captains of industry, socialites in the Gilded Age, and then this radical Romanesque design of the Glessner House by Boston architect H.H. Richardson was the architect's response to the Glessners' wish to be trendsetters. Farm machine magnate John Glessner and his wife Frances furnished the house in arts and crafts style considered the cutting age in its day, with gorgeous upholstery and wall coverings by the renowned British developer William Morris. The wealthy abandoned the neighborhood in the early 1900s, and most of the mansions were cut up into boarding houses or torn down. I found this picture on the Habs website. Look, it's just completely covered in soot. But the Glessners stayed on until their deaths, and then they knew they had something significant, so they willed the house to the American Institute of Architects in hopes that it would be preserved. But with the decline of the neighborhood, the house changed hands several times. It ended up as a laboratory for an industrial printing company and was eventually put on sale. This is a close-up of that picture I just showed you, and so you can see it's still got the printing company logo sort of stuck in the tympanum there over the doorway, and then the building is for sale. And thankfully, in 1966, a grassroots group calling itself the Chicago School of Architecture Foundation, that's a mouthful, raised money and bought the house for $35,000. As a point of comparison, a townhome a block from there today is under contract for $1.1 million. Restoring the house took many decades, but fortunately, the Glessners had recorded the minutest details of their privileged lives in daily journals, and their son John was an avid photographer and documented every room. So as a result, little by little, the house was restored to almost exactly as it looked when the Glessners lived there, including much of the original furnishings, which is extremely rare because these were returned by the Glessners' heirs. A number of historic gems have been magnificently restored, including the Rookery at Adams and LaSalle from 1888 by Burnham and Root. Prior to restoration, the magnificent lobby had been turned into a gloomy space with the skylight. I found this picture on Habs. The skylight covered up, and look at how the mezzanine there has been walled off. The Reliance Building, a pioneering early skyscraper by Burnham and Root, completed in 1895 by Charles Atwood after Root's death. This is kitty corner from the Marshall Fields. I still say Marshall Fields on State Street. And I found another great picture of this one. It had long been covered in soot, with the ground floor modernized as the home to Carol's Men's Store. Today it's been adaptively reused as a hotel. Frank Lloyd Wright's Roby House from 1909 in Hyde Park, a revolutionary concept in domestic life. Unlike typical Victorian homes of the day, which were cut up into small, dimly lit rooms, Roby House contains open, flowing spaces, one into the next, and walls of windows breaking down the barrier between outside and in. So this home was one of the stars, actually, of the PBS special that the commissioner referenced, 10 Buildings That Changed America. And then Unity Temple out in Oak Park from 1908, where all the leaks were fixed. And the interior colors brought back, the innovative, if flawed, concrete exterior repaired, every bit of wood removed, stripped, and refinished and reinstalled. So all of these restorations have in common one thing, the four that I just mentioned, the restoration architect, Gunny Harbaugh. I featured one of Gunny Harbaugh's most recent restorations in a new show that I just debuted a year ago called The Most Beautiful Places in Chicago. And this most recent restoration is inside the Cultural Center, which was built in 1897 as the Chicago Public Library by H.H. Richardson's successor firm, Shepley, Rattan, and Coolidge. Don't you love this picture? Like, it's amazing. It's like a time capsule. So in the show, I'm going to show you my third clip now. Harbaugh walks us through the process of restoring the GAR Hall and Dome, which is the second dome on the north side of the building. And he sums up in this clip, I thought better than I could, the value and the power of preservation. So let's turn up the volume here and one more clip.
The dome was covered over in the late 20s, early 30s. And they put concrete, precast concrete elements, because it had always leaked probably, and they covered it up.
Daylight was replaced by ugly, dull, fluorescent lighting beneath the concrete dome. To restore the dome, Harbaugh enlisted Chicago's DePrato Regali Studios, which has been in the stained glass business since 1860.
They completely removed all the pieces. They had to build custom crates. And each one of these panels came out, went in the crate, and went to their studio. And once they got there, first they did rubbings of everything, photographs, then they would lay it on a bench. And then once they documented it completely, then they take it all apart. They put it in a big bath, and they washed every single piece by hand. Yeah. All 60,000 plus, whatever, however the number is. So they were able to, to have it sing again the way it is. It's really beautiful.
But the dome was only part of the challenge. The project involved restoring the entire Tiffany-designed hall to its former glory. What condition was this place in when you got started?
All these rooms had been renovated in the 1970s.
Renovated.
Yeah, and all the things, everywhere where you see this beautiful green and in the other room that deep red, that had all been painted over with kind of a off-white, gray color, sort of.
Restoring colors typically involves repainting surfaces to replicate the original. But here, thanks to a remarkable discovery, Harbaugh was able to unearth the original finishes for the first time in his career.
We spent about a year in discovery and research, and we were able to see that you could remove this overburden paint and then this green paint, and in the other room the red paint. It was there. And that was like, whoa. But of course, all that paint had to be removed. That was the Herculean task of the crew that was in here for 6 months. They found they could cleave off the later paint, and it would leave the original surface there. And then they could, touch that up like you would do an actual painting. I mean, when you're looking at this thing, you are seeing pretty much what it was when it was first done. And that's unusual, very unusual. I've never had in 30 plus years, I've never had a project where we were able to really conserve original surfaces in the manner we did this.
You've done a lot of restoration, but this job actually has some personal meaning for you.
I didn't realize it at the beginning, but it was a revelation during the course of the thing. And what was the key is in that room, there's this big ornamental medallion on the wall, of metal. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that looks familiar to me. And I knew I had this, which is the GAR pin that my great-grandfather and my namesake, and he served in the Civil War. He was mustered 3 times. The first time he was 16 and a half. And finally, near the end of the war is when he actually served.
There is this period in the history of a building where it's not quite old enough to be historic yet. It just seems old. And isn't that when buildings are really at risk?
Yeah, this building was going to be destroyed. I mean, that's, can you believe that? Yeah, but it's true.
What have we preserved by not tearing it down?
Well, if you just look around. I mean, you come into this space, if you sat here during the day and watch people's reaction walking in here, they almost all fall over. Your body reacts in a way that is beyond your consciousness.
I love how he characterizes that. So I am thrilled that very recently the Thompson Center from 1985 by the late Helmut Jahn has been saved from the wrecking ball. Google has just started restoring and remodeling it for their Chicago headquarters. This is a rendering. Like Prentice Hospital, not everyone sees beauty in this building, but I love it. Yes, it absolutely had HVAC problems, and yes, the open interior was too noisy for state workers to do their jobs. Little problem there. But Jan created one of the most dramatic interior spaces you will ever see, and also kind of a model for his Sony Center in Berlin, if you know that building. And I hope Google keeps it open to the public, and I hope it also becomes a catalyst for recovery downtown, which is, as we all know, suffering from record vacancy rates and loss of retail, raising fears of how so many historic buildings can be repurposed and saved. In recent years, I'm going to conclude with this, the idea of preservation has spread beyond saving buildings for their architectural significance. Today, preservation efforts recognize buildings as places for their historical value as well. So, for example, the area of the West Loop called the Fulton-Randolph District, characterized by industrial buildings, was landmarked because it was once the heart of Chicago's wholesale produce markets, where many blue-collar immigrant workers toiled. And considering that today this is probably the city's hottest real estate, booming with restaurants and new construction, it's possible that all traces of that history would have been erased without landmark designation. Many buildings throughout Chicago's neighborhoods have been landmarked, including firehouses, banks, pubs, places that reflect diverse communities like the LGBTQ Legacy Walk, the Paseo Boricua Flag Gateway, the Little Village Arch, and the home of Mamie Till Mobley and her young son Emmett Till, whose lynching in the South brought new and urgent attention, to civil rights. And of course, not everything can be saved. It's impossible, nor should it be. So to conclude, I want to highlight a different kind of preservation that was well-intentioned, but a little short on fact-checking. So for the city's 100th birthday in 1937, a celebration dubbed the Chicago Charter Jubilee, a committee erected plaques. These are, you gotta find these. The city erected plaques all over town commemorating lost historic sites. They were called Jubilee markers, and they are riddled with inaccuracies. Some quite humorous, others not so humorous, actually, but they do reflect how people in another time wanted to tell the stories of our history, kind of like what the alderman was talking about. So I'll start with some that are not so funny. But so in Rogers Park, this plaque memorializes what today we consider a shameful part of Chicago's history, the Indian boundary line. As the United States expanded westward, the federal government coerced Native Americans into signing treaties so that they're banishing them west of the Mississippi so they could sell their land to settlers. And as part of that treaty, a line was drawn on a map forbidding indigenous people from owning property within 10 miles of the Chicago River. And if you know Rogers Avenue and Rogers Park is a diagonal, that goes right along the old Indian boundary line, as does Forest Preserve Drive, farther out west by O'Hare. And this plaque is located right where the line crosses Clark Street. And sometime later, maybe in an inadvertent message about this dishonorable chapter in our history, the Department of Transportation put this traffic control box right in front of it. This marker in the Sauganash neighborhood on the northwest side supposedly commemorates the treaty that banished Native Americans west of the Mississippi for good under the, quote, Old Treaty Elm. The tree stood here until 1933. The plaque reads that it, quote, marked the northern boundary of the Fort Dearborn Reserve, the center of Billy Caldwell, Chief Sauganash's reservation, and the site of the Indian Treaty of 1835. Almost none of that's true. No treaty was signed under it. In fact, there was no treaty at all in 1835. The Treaty of Chicago took place at Fort Dearborn at the mouth of the Chicago River in 1833. And this is, we'll get to some funny ones here in a second, but this one is the most egregious. A plaque that once stood in Pioneer Court, which is the plaza next to the Tribune, commemorated the site of what was called the Kinsey Mansion, and it read, quote, here was born in 1805 the city's first white child, Ellen Marion Kinsey. This all but ignored the fact that the home's first owner was a person of color. In fact, Chicago's first permanent resident, Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable, and by the way, the date was wrong too. Ellen Kinsey was born in 1804. Okay, so my last two markers are just plain hilarious. On the side of an apartment building up by Graceland Cemetery at Byron and Clark, this plaque marks the calaboose. I had to look that up. The calaboose was one of many slang terms for jail, in this case the jail of the town of Lakeview, which was annexed to Chicago in 1889. But here's the trouble. According to the town's records, the original Lakeview calaboose was in the town hall, which was at the northwest corner of Addison and Halstead, about a mile away from here, from there. And this is my absolute favorite. This is a plaque I can't show you because it's a lost plaque. Oh, I wonder if I have a... oh, I do. So the plaque used to be right here, I think, right on this wall. So this plaque marked the famous loop cow path. This was a passageway, so the cow path was behind this door here. This was a passageway through what is now a hotel at 100 West Monroe. There were no cows living in the loop when this building was constructed in 1928, but the passageway, this passageway right here, was left open anyway because the deed required it. It was part of a strip of land that an enterprising farmer named Willard Jones retained for his use when he sold his property way back in 1840. According to newspaper accounts, Jones wanted to be sure he could always have a strip of land so he could walk his cows to pasture. The plaque long ago disappeared, and there were no official documents proving the easement really was for a cow path, but that didn't stop organizers of Chicago's International Livestock Exposition from milking the idea for publicity, periodically startling office workers by bringing cows to the building for photo opportunities. So, why is it important to save parts of our past? Well, I've seen the value of this in my own work, making all these TV shows over the years. I just cannot tell you how many times people who've seen one show or another of mine come up to me on the street and they say, oh, I've lived here all my life and I never knew that. Or I pass that building every day and I never noticed that, or I never knew the story behind it. And the excitement in their voice tells me that this isn't just about fun facts. Knowing the history that surrounds us connects us. And we understand that we have a shared community with that is specific, not generic. It's a living organism, and we can feel it because we are embedded in it. It is a part of us. And, I think that's a good reason why preservation is important. So that's my talk for you. But now I guess we'll have a little Q&A. 5 minutes. Okay, someone will have to give me a 5-minute warning. Thank you.
Gabby or someone from the preservation team can possibly circulate the mic so that we can answer, or maybe I will. I don't mind doing it.
I don't know that I'm...
Oh, we actually have mics here. I didn't even see them. We actually have mics here. So if you're able to work your way down here, please do. If not, just raise your hand and I'm happy to run up for the mic.
Oh, here's someone. Okay, very good. Yes. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Tanya Smith, S-M-I-T-H. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you work only on preservation of buildings or other historical items as well?
Do I work, my personal work, so I'm not a preservationist, I'm a TV producer and program host, so my work is about all kinds of Chicago architecture and Chicago history, and so I tell all kinds of stories about Chicago history, not just about buildings. My doorway into this work was through architecture because I'm a tour guide, a docent for the Chicago Architecture Center, and have been doing these. Yeah. Do we have docents out here? Oh, all right. I'm about to go take a river tour after this because I have to give a river tour next week, and I haven't taken one yet this year. But over the years, I've told a lot of other kinds of stories.
We own about 400,000 historical maps of Chicago metropolitan area. Me and my husband, his family has been involved in map making and land surveying since 1854. And we are looking for a new good home for this archive because we both passed retirement age and would like to retire at some point. That's why I asked, because we need help finding organization or a group of organization who can take this archive and finish scanning and preserve it for research in the future.
I'm not, if I don't know, Ward, if you've got any ideas about that. Maybe you can talk afterwards, but this is actually I hear from people all the time that this is a big problem. People have these collections, and archives are extremely selective in what they can handle, So somebody will call. I cleaned out my office about a year ago, and I found all this stuff that people sent me, and I called, I found a whole collection of Swedish stuff, and I called the Swedish History Museum, and I found, people just send me stuff. And museums are so selective about what they have room for and what they can curate. It is a big problem. I'm not an expert in this, but...
I understand. The best suggestion we heard from representatives from the Newberry Library actually trying to organize a consortium of local universities.
Yeah.
So
I see some people interested here, so maybe they can talk to you about this.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. I think they're bringing you a microphone.
I have so many questions that I would love to ask you another time because you know so much about Chicago and its history. But I want to ask one that is a little bit leading. Given how important the legacy of the built environment is to Chicago culturally, do you think that it's time that Chicago conduct another or update its existing survey of historical resources? The last historical resources survey in Chicago was begun in the 1980s and completed early in the 1990s. By law, it is supposed to be updated. It's never been updated. It exists only as a print document. You can't search it up on the internet and with integrated with other data. In your work, looking around at the city's history, I'm sure you've noticed, having done this for a long time, right? You were a much younger man when you filmed the videos. Time keeps moving. We keep building things, right? New things. I like to say I was born in the 1970s, and so I am keenly aware that the 1970s turn 50 this decade. They become historic. Don't you think, and wouldn't you add your voice to the chorus suggesting that we update that survey?
So, sounds like a good idea to me. In my position, I don't take positions because I'm a journalist, and actually we have a pretty strong position on our editorial standards. So I don't, and by the way, the Chicago Architecture Center, I don't know if this is still true, docents, but one of our founding principles was not to take positions, but to educate, just to simply educate. So, I think there's the commissioner over there. You guys can have a conversation. Yes.
Hi, my name is Josh Gartler. I'm Vice President of Logan Square Preservation. We're a local organization that serves to preserve and educate individuals about Logan Square, and I wanted to thank the department, the DPD, for holding this event today. This has been great, and I'd like to encourage future events like this, perhaps with some seminars or breakout meetings that we can actually share information amongst preservation organizations. But one thing I wanted to mention was that being a preservationist does not mean that we are NIMBYs, that we don't want development in our wards or in the city of Chicago. It's smart preservation and smart development that we're looking for. And I think that's one of the major problems with being a preservation organization, is that we're constantly battling with those developers who have deep pockets that are constantly insisting that this can't be done any other way but tear down this building and build something new. What is your feeling about, because you did say some things should be preserved and some things shouldn't. We have a lot of empty spaces in this city that have empty lots that certainly could be built on rather than tearing things down. What sorts of initiatives do you think should be initiated in the city to preserve historic buildings that aren't necessarily landmark buildings, historic neighborhoods that you can't landmark everything in a neighborhood, right, but keeping the character of the neighborhood is important to everyone.
It is. I'm not an advocate. I'm certainly not a preservationist, and I'm not an architect. I don't have that kind of knowledge. But the fabric of a neighborhood, the fabric of any place, makes it, specific and not generic. And it's connected to how we feel about being there, right? So I was talking to the commissioner beforehand. I was in Paris a couple months ago, I love Paris. And it's a smaller city than Chicago. And it is teeming with life. And partly it's because people live, work, and shop all in the same place. Of course, it's also very concentrated in a small area. But you'll walk down the street and there'll be like this fabulous modern, turn a corner and there'll be this fabulous modern building, like amazing modern building, like whatever you think of the Pompidou Center, or some other, amazing building. But then, a lot of the fabric is still maintained. The other issue we have in our country is that we're a much more diverse country. Not Europe now is becoming much more diverse, but so it's a little easier in a place where you have you don't have a monoculture of buildings, but you have a pretty long, history of one culture living there and having kind of the values and understanding of their one culture. We're a nation of immigrants and of migration, and obviously we know Chicago is very segregated. So that's kind of wandering off the point, but I mean, I think there has to be a balance, and I like what you said, that you're not opposed to development. But how that happens, I mostly report on things rather than advocating one way or the other for them. I kind of look at what's happened, and a lot of it we regret. I mean, I guess maybe that's part of what we want to think about. I see cycles, right? The loop was dead in the 1980s, in the late 1970s, early 1980s. In the way that it's kind of starting to be dead again now with work from home and less retail. You see cycles repeat, right? And I think the city did a pretty good job with State Street kind of zoning. It wasn't zoning, but there was, the university buildings that were built at one end, retail at another end. They kind of made a plan. But there was also a plan to tear it all down, which thankfully didn't happen. So I think also looking back at historic cycles, we tend to forget that we've been here before. Maybe that's part of the answer, is understanding a little more about history and seeing what's happened before. That might be one way. I see one more question.
We got one more.
Yes. Oh, hi, Ernie.
Yes, my name is Constantine Basel, and I have a case of partial preservation. There was a church outside of Milwaukee that had the foresight to buy the dome of a huge, beautiful building in Chicago that was being demolished, and they've used it in their church. Now, I forget what the name of the building was. It may have been the federal building that you showed. I'm not sure.
That would be amazing.
This church is just beautiful if you go inside and so on. We saw it on a tour, and unfortunately, I don't remember all the details, the name and so on. But you might, I don't know, if you're not aware of it, you might want to look into it.
So that makes me think, that is fascinating. And this raises, there is so much controversy about this kind of thing, right? Facadism. There's another church, actually. It was a South, do you know what I'm talking about? There was a South Side church that was completely dismantled, the facade of it, and it's been reconstructed up in somewhere like Chain of Lakes. St. John of God. And a lot of people really objected to that, like sort of wholesale moving of, not moving the building, but sort of taking down the facade and putting it somewhere else. Other people think it's a great idea because you've saved something. If you look at the buildings along Wabash, where it's a building called the Legacy is, there's another one called the Heritage. There were these old Italianate buildings right along the L tracks there, and Millennium Park really amped up development, and they wanted to build these really tall towers that could see over Michigan Avenue with a view of Millennium Park and Grant Park. And so they tore down the buildings, but they saved the facades. So if you walk under the L tracks along Wabash, you see the facades of these old buildings, but behind them are 100% new, modern towers. Some people say that's an abomination, Other people think, well, if you've, preserved something at street level that still gives you the flavor of what the street was like at one time, and there's retail in there, why not? If the buildings aren't serving a purpose, why not find some way to reuse them? But this is facadism, and it gets a bad name. So again, I don't take a position one way or the other, but it's very controversial and it's interesting. So thank you for that. All right, I think that's all we have time for. Yes.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Alderman, so much for making the time to come out today. I want to thank you, Geoffrey, for your thoughtful, amazing, thought-provoking discussion today. Chicago remains a very special place, our downtown, right? The idea of marrying new construction while really thinking thoughtfully about the preservation of our buildings is a special discussion here, and a thoughtful task for us to really think about as it relates to real estate development. And so I want to thank all of our partners that are here today. I want to thank all the thought leaders that are here today. Geoffrey, you're amazing. This is amazing. Thank you for taking the time to come and just share your knowledge with us about the special space and place that Chicago is and all of the historic gems that surround our city. So thank you for just highlighting it and your commitment. I want to remind everyone that the exhibition hall will remain open for another hour until 2 o'clock. So please feel free to stick around and enjoy the rest of the day. And again, I want to thank my incredible team at DPD for the very hard work of putting together our very first event like this today. So thank you all, and thank you, Geoffrey.